The entire restaurant went silent as my daughter-in-law's words cut through me like a knife. If you can't afford to eat here, stay home and cook. Then, to make it worse, she shoved me back as if I were a beggar. My face burned with shame, and that's when I vowed she would regret every single word. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. I remember that night so clearly, as though it happened only yesterday. The air was warm, and I felt a quiet excitement as I made my way to my daughter-in-law's restaurant. I wasn't alone. I had invited 3 of my old friends to join me. These were men I had known for decades, friends who had stood by me through life's ups and downs. That evening I wanted to show them how well my family was doing, how my son had married a woman ambitious enough to open her own business. There was pride in my chest as I walked through those doors, expecting smiles, warmth, and maybe even a little gratitude for supporting her. The restaurant looked beautiful. Soft lighting glowed across the tables, the scent of freshly cooked food drifted through the air, and the staff bustled about, carrying trays and greeting customers. I felt proud that this was my daughter-in-law's creation. My friends looked around, nodding in approval. We took our seats, and I couldn't help but beam as the servers brought out steaming dishes, rich in aroma and taste. We laughed, shared old stories, and for a moment I believed this night would be one of celebration, a memory we would all hold close. But life has a way of twisting joy into something bitter. When the meal was finished and the plates cleared, I held the bill in my hand. It wasn't the money that concerned me. I could easily afford it. It was more about feeling included, about family understanding one another. With a gentle smile, I asked her if she might give us a small family discount. Nothing outrageous, just a gesture of goodwill. What I received instead was cruelty. Her voice, sharp and mocking, cut across the room as though she wanted every ear to hear. And when she shoved me aside like I was nothing more than a nuisance, the humiliation pierced deeper than any wound. My friends looked at me, their eyes wide with discomfort, but I said nothing. Inside, though, I was breaking. I stood there in silence, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a mountain. My friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter gone, replaced by pity in their eyes. That was the part that hurt the most. These were men who had known me in my strongest days, men who had seen me build a life from nothing, and now they were forced to witness me being treated like some desperate old man begging for scraps. I forced a smile, one that barely held together, and slowly reached for my wallet. The bill wasn't much, not for me at least. I laid down the money carefully, making sure it covered every penny, even leaving a generous tip for the waiters who had done nothing wrong. It wasn't their fault that their boss had chosen to shame me in front of a room full of strangers. I could feel their eyes on me too, the servers caught between their loyalty to their employer and the sympathy they felt for me. I gave them a small nod, a silent thank you, and then turned to my friends. "Shall we?" I asked quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't argue. They rose with me, but I could feel their unease as we made our way to the door. The laughter that had filled our table earlier was gone, replaced by an awkward silence that followed us out of the restaurant and into the night air. The walk home felt longer than usual. Each step echoed with humiliation, my chest tight with a mix of sadness and fury. How could she? My own daughter-in-law, someone I had welcomed into the family, had treated me with such disdain over dinner money. It wasn't the discount I cared about. It was the principle, the respect that family owed one another. When I reached my home, I sat down alone in the dark, staring at the walls as memories of her words replayed in my mind. "Stay home and cook." That phrase seared itself into me like fire. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't angry at the money. I wasn't even angry at the push. I was angry at the public shame, the way she had stripped me of my dignity in front of others. And in that moment, one thought began to grow in my mind, quiet but powerful. She will regret this. That night, as I sat in silence, memories of my life began to surface. People often see an older man and think he is harmless, fragile, and powerless, but they forget the road he has walked to reach this age. They forget the battles he has fought and the storms he has survived. I was not a man who lived an easy life. I had built everything with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. When I was young, I worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. I labored in factories during the day, came home smelling of sweat and steel, and then worked nights fixing old cars for neighbors who couldn't afford a mechanic. Slowly, I saved, invested, and climbed. Over the years, I turned those long nights into opportunities. Real. estate, small businesses, property management. Piece by piece, I built a portfolio that secured my family's future. My son grew up in comfort because of the sacrifices I made, sacrifices I never once regretted. I thought marrying a woman with ambition would only strengthen the family. When my daughter-in-law opened her restaurant, I was proud. I told everyone about it. I supported her whenever I could. I even sent friends and colleagues her way to give her business. I never asked for much in return, just respect and acknowledgement of the bond we shared. But that night, she reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. Never mistake silence for weakness. Her shove, her cruel words, and her arrogance woke something inside me that had been sleeping for years. The old fire, the same fire that pushed me to survive when I had nothing, began to burn again. I realized then that revenge doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be fast. True revenge is patient. It waits. It observes. And when the moment is right, it strikes in silence with precision. As I sat there in my chair, the darkness around me felt like an ally. I knew I wouldn't raise my voice, I wouldn't beg, and I wouldn't argue with her again. Instead, I would remind her who I truly was, not through words, but through actions. She thought she had embarrassed me that night, but she had only given me the spark I needed to remind her that I was not to be underestimated. The next morning, my humiliation had hardened into determination. I rose with a clear mind, sharper than it had been in years. I wasn't going to confront her directly. That would be too easy for her to dismiss. No, I needed to know where she was weakest. I needed to understand the foundation of her little empire, because only then could I decide how best to bring it down. I began with quiet observation. I visited the restaurant at odd hours, slipping in during lunch shifts and lingering outside at closing time. What I saw was not the glamorous, thriving business she bragged about to the family. The staff looked exhausted, their movements hurried but heavy with frustration. I overheard whispers of late paychecks and schedules that changed without warning. One young waitress, barely old enough to be out of school, muttered to a coworker about quitting because she hadn't been paid in 2 weeks. That was my first clue. I started asking questions, not loudly, but carefully, to people in the community. A supplier told me he was still waiting on a large payment for goods delivered over a month ago. A neighbor mentioned she had seen delivery men arguing with my daughter-in-law in the back alley, demanding their money. Slowly, a picture began to form. Behind the polished front she showed to customers, cracks were spreading through her business. She was drowning in debt, barely keeping her head above water. I dug deeper, making discreet calls to contacts I had from my years in business. It didn't take long before I learned the truth. Rent payments had been late more than once. The landlord was growing impatient. Banks were circling, watching carefully for missed deadlines. It was only a matter of time before her restaurant collapsed under its own weight. And yet, she strutted around like a queen, humiliating others, pretending she was untouchable. She had no idea how close she was to losing everything. As I pieced it all together, I felt no pity. She hadn't just disrespected me. She had disrespected her staff, her community, and everyone who tried to support her. She built her little kingdom on arrogance, and I could see now that all it needed was the right push to topple over. The plan was beginning to take shape in my mind. I didn't need to raise my voice, and I didn't need to confront her in anger. All I had to do was wait for the perfect opening, and when it came, I would strike silently and completely. It was almost too easy. The more I uncovered, the more obvious it became that her entire business was hanging by a thread. All I had to do was tug, and the whole thing would unravel. Still, I waited patiently for the right move, and that move came one crisp afternoon when I arranged a quiet meeting with her landlord. The man was older, tired-looking, with lines on his face carved by years of stress. He knew who I was before I even introduced myself, and when I brought up my daughter-in-law's restaurant, he let out a long sigh. "She's behind again," he muttered, shaking his head. "Always some excuse, always a promise that things will get better, but it never does. I'm sick of it." I leaned forward, my voice calm and steady. "And if you could walk away from all that trouble right now, would you?" He looked at me with weary eyes, then gave a humorless laugh. "If I could, I'd sign the papers this very minute." That was all I needed to hear. I placed an envelope on the table, thick with documents I had prepared in advance. Inside was my offer, fair, generous even, but most importantly, it was immediate. No waiting, no games, no drawn-out process. just relief for him, an opportunity for me. The landlord flipped through the papers, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the numbers. He glanced back up at me, measuring the seriousness in my expression. I didn't flinch. "You're serious?" he asked. "Deadly serious," I replied. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then he reached for a pen. His signature glided across the page, and with each stroke, I felt the weight of power shift into my hands. When the final paper was signed, I leaned back, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was done. The restaurant she had boasted about, the one she had used as a throne to humiliate me, was no longer hers. She still thought she owned it, still strutted around barking orders, but in reality, every brick, every chair, every spoon on those tables now belonged to me. I walked out of that meeting with a lightness in my step, my heart beating with a quiet thrill. She had no idea, and that ignorance made it all the sweeter. The time would come to reveal the truth, but not yet. No, I wanted her to feel secure, to believe she was still in control, because when the truth finally hit her, it would crush her far more than my words ever could. That night, I sat in my chair with the signed papers on the table in front of me. I read them over again and again, though I didn't need to. Every word was etched into my mind, every line a reminder that the restaurant was no longer hers. It was mine. The irony of it all made me chuckle to myself. Just days earlier, she had shoved me aside like a beggar. Now, she was unknowingly working for me, trapped in a cage she hadn't even noticed had closed around her. But revenge is not only about the strike, it is about the patience before it. I could have walked into her restaurant the very next day, waved the documents in her face, and watched her crumble on the spot. But that would have been too easy, too sudden. No, I wanted the moment to linger, to grow and wait, so that when the truth finally came crashing down, it would break her in the same way she had tried to break me. In those days that followed, I watched from the shadows. I passed by her restaurant and saw her strutting about, barking at the staff, pretending she was a successful businesswoman. She carried herself like a queen, but I knew she was a queen without a crown, ruling over a kingdom that was no longer hers. The thought made me smile every time. I began to plan how I would reveal it to her. I didn't want the moment to be private. No, privacy would soften the blow, and I wanted it to land with the same sting she had given me. She had chosen to humiliate me in front of strangers, her staff and my friends. So she would face her downfall in front of those same people, her audience, her court, the very ones she had tried to impress by stepping on me. I pictured it over and over, the look on her face, the gasp of the staff, the silence of the restaurant. The vision alone kept me awake at night, not with anger, but with anticipation. For the first time in days, I felt peace. I didn't need to shout or seek pity. I didn't need to confront her with harsh words. My silence was enough, because soon my actions would speak louder than anything I could ever say. And when that day came, she would know that her arrogance had cost her everything. The day I had been waiting for finally arrived. I chose it carefully. A Friday evening, the busiest night of the week. The restaurant would be full, every table occupied, every pair of eyes ready to witness what I had been holding inside. I dressed sharply, not extravagantly, but with dignity. I wanted to walk in not as a broken old man, but as someone who carried the quiet strength of truth. When I opened the door, the smell of food and chatter washed over me. The place was alive, buzzing with customers. My daughter-in-law was moving around the room, chin lifted high, greeting patrons like a proud hostess. The staff followed her commands with strained smiles, their weariness hidden behind polite masks. She spotted me almost immediately. Her lips curled into a smirk, and I could see the mockery in her eyes. "Well, look who's back," she said, her voice loud enough to carry across several tables. "Here to ask for another discount?" Laughter rippled from a corner table where a few of her friends sat, eager to please her with their chuckles. I didn't answer. I let her words hang in the air, let them echo the same way they had the last time I stood here humiliated. But this time, there was no shame burning inside me, only calm, only patience. I stepped further into the room, my steps deliberate, my silence unnerving. The staff paused, sensing something different about this visit. My daughter-in-law, emboldened by the silence, crossed her arms and tilted her head, mocking me further. "Did you forget your wallet this time?" she sneered. That was when I spoke, my voice firm and steady. "Gather the staff. I have an announcement to make." The room quieted. Forks and knives paused mid-air. The staff exchanged uncertain glances before slowly gathering near. My daughter-in-law frowned, clearly irritated but also curious. She tapped her foot, arms crossed tighter. "What could you possibly have to say?" she scoffed. I looked around the room, at the faces of strangers, at the staff who had suffered under her arrogance, and then back at her. "As of today," I said, my voice carrying through every corner of the restaurant, "this business is under new ownership." A ripple of shock moved through the staff. My daughter-in-law blinked, then burst into laughter. "New ownership? Don't be ridiculous." But I didn't laugh. I simply smiled, because I knew what came next would silence her forever. Her laughter rang across the room, shrill and mocking, as though she thought I had told the funniest joke of the evening. She turned to her staff, expecting them to join in, but their faces told a different story. They looked from her to me, their eyes wide with confusion, curiosity, even a flicker of hope. They had heard her ridicule me before, but this time something in my tone was different. "What nonsense are you talking about?" she snapped, her face flushing red. "This is my restaurant. Everyone here knows that. Stop trying to embarrass yourself again." But I didn't flinch. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a thick brown envelope. I held it up for all to see, the weight of it heavy in my hand, not just with paper, but with power. "These," I said calmly, "are the ownership papers, signed and sealed. This building, this business, every table, every plate, it all belongs to me now." Gasps spread through the room. The staff leaned forward, eyes darting between the envelope and their so-called boss. My daughter-in-law froze, the smirk slipping from her face as I opened the envelope and unfolded the official documents. I laid them flat on the nearest table for all to see. The landlord's signature gleamed in ink, the stamp of transfer clear and undeniable. "That's impossible," she stammered, her voice trembling now. She rushed forward, snatching at the papers with frantic hands, scanning them with wide, desperate eyes. Each line she read was another blow to her pride. "You're lying," she hissed. "This can't be real." But it was real, and everyone in that room could see it. The waiters leaned closer, reading the war with quiet satisfaction. A cook poked his head out from the kitchen, whispering in disbelief to a coworker. Customers shifted in their seats, some murmuring, some watching with fascination. I remained silent, letting the moment stretch, letting her choke on the reality of it, her arrogance, her cruelty, the empire she had built on humiliation. It was gone. And the best part was that she had no one to blame but herself. Finally, I looked her in the eyes. "You see, you thought you could push me aside like a beggar, but you never stopped to think that maybe I had more power than you ever imagined." Her lips trembled, but no words came. The silence of the room weighed heavier than any insult she had ever thrown at me. The room was silent except for the sound of her shallow breathing as she clutched the papers with trembling hands. Her face was pale now, drained of the smug arrogance she had once worn like a crown. She turned to me, her voice cracking, no longer filled with mockery, but with disbelief. You can't do this. This is my life, my dream. You wouldn't dare." I stepped closer, my eyes locked on hers. For the first time, she wasn't towering over me with her words or her pride. For the first time, she looked small. "Do you remember the night you shoved me in front of everyone?" I asked, my voice steady, but heavy with the weight of memory. "Do you remember when you told me, your own father-in-law, to stay home and cook because I wasn't worth a discount?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. The staff behind her exchanged glances, some of them nodding ever so slightly, as though they too remembered, as though they had been waiting for this very moment. I straightened my back, letting my words fill the room. "That night, you humiliated me. You stripped me of my dignity in front of strangers, in front of my friends, and in front of your staff. And now, I stand here not with anger, but with justice." I turned to the staff, who had gathered closer, their faces eager, waiting. Then I looked back at her, delivering the words I had held inside for so long. "You're fired." The words dropped like thunder, echoing in the silence that followed. Gasps erupted. A waitress put her hand over her mouth, eyes wide in shock and relief. One of the cooks muttered under his breath, "Finally." Even the customers, who had paused mid-meal to watch the scene unfold, leaned back in their seats, stunned at what they had just witnessed. Her knees buckled slightly, and she gripped the papers like a lifeline. You can't do this to me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the truth was staring her in the face. I already had. I stepped back, calm and composed. "This is no longer your restaurant. You no longer have power here. Leave with whatever dignity you still have, or stay and be escorted out. The choice is yours." She stared at me, tears welling in her eyes, and then, without another word, she stormed toward the door. The papers slipped from her hands, fluttering to the floor as the staff looked on. The queen had fallen, and there was no throne left for her to sit on. When the door slammed shut behind her, the room remained frozen for a moment. Then slowly, like a spell had been broken, whispers rose from the staff, and the tension that had gripped them seemed to dissolve. I bent down and gathered the papers she had dropped, folding them neatly back into the envelope. I didn't need to say anything more. The truth had spoken for itself. The staff turned toward me, uncertain but hopeful, as though waiting to see what kind of man would lead them now. I could see exhaustion in their eyes, the kind that comes from long hours of being mistreated. I also saw something else, relief, like a weight had been lifted. "I won't pretend this will be easy," I said, my voice calm but firm. "But I promise you this. From today forward, you'll be treated with the respect you deserve. This restaurant will not be built on fear or arrogance. It will be built on dignity, hard work, and pride." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. One of the younger waiters, the same boy I had once overheard complaining about late pay, actually smiled. A cook wiped his hands on his apron and nodded. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. The very next day, I rolled up my sleeves and began making changes. The menu was revised with the help of the chefs, who finally felt free to contribute their ideas. The staff schedules were reorganized, so everyone had fair shifts and proper breaks. Suppliers were paid on time, and I made sure to meet with them personally, reassuring them that this business was no longer run by someone who made empty promises. It wasn't just about running a restaurant. It was about healing the wounds left behind. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The staff moved with more purpose, their smiles genuine now, instead of forced. Customers noticed the difference too. They felt it in the warmth of the service, in the pride that radiated from the team. Word began to spread in the community that the place had transformed. Every evening when I locked up, I felt a quiet satisfaction settle in my chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about creating something better, proving that respect and kindness could build what arrogance had nearly destroyed. And yet, even as the restaurant flourished, I couldn't help but wonder about her, what she thought as she watched everything she had lost grow stronger without her. Weeks passed, and with each day, the restaurant grew stronger. What had once been a place weighed down by arrogance and tension was now filled with life. The air buzzed with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of conversations that felt lighter than before. Even the walls seemed brighter, as though the very building had been freed from the chains of her cruelty. My friends, the same men who had watched me humiliated that night, returned one evening. They walked through the doors with cautious expressions, unsure of what they would find. But when they saw me standing confidently at the front, shaking hands with customers and greeting the staff like family, their faces lit up. "This place feels different," one of them whispered as he looked around. "It feels alive." I guided them to a table, and as the staff served us, I could see pride in their movements. Plates arrived on time, steaming and beautiful, and every smile offered to my friends was genuine. The old discomfort that had weighed on them the last time we ate here was gone. In its place was admiration, not just for the restaurant, but for me. They raised their glasses in a toast. "To dignity restored," one said, and I felt a warmth in my chest I hadn't felt in a long time. That night, laughter returned to our table, but this time it was untainted by shame. Outside of my circle, the community began to notice the transformation as well. Customers returned not just for the food, but for the atmosphere. Families who had stopped coming because of poor treatment found themselves welcomed again. Word spread quickly. Under new management, the restaurant had become a place of respect and joy. Even the suppliers, who had once threatened to cut ties, came back with smiles and firm handshakes. "It's good to work with someone who honors his word," one told me. Those words mattered more than he realized. They were proof that reputation, once damaged, could be rebuilt with honesty and effort. Every evening, as I watched the last customers leave and the staff clean up with laughter in their voices, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I had not only avenged my humiliation, I had created a space where people wanted to belong. The revenge was sweet, but the success that followed made it even sweeter. Still, I knew the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Because somewhere out there, my daughter-in-law was watching, and the fall from her throne was only the beginning of her lesson. While the restaurant thrived under my care, her life took a very different turn. Word travels quickly in a small community, and it wasn't long before everyone knew the truth. Customers who once humored her arrogance now whispered about her downfall. Suppliers who had been burned by her late payments shook their heads at the mere mention of her name. She had gone from a self-proclaimed queen of the business to nothing more than a bitter reminder of pride gone wrong. I heard rumors of her trying to open another place, but without investors or a landlord willing to trust her, doors slammed in her face one after another. Banks turned her away, unwilling to take a chance on someone who had already proven reckless. Even her friends, the ones who once laughed at her cruel jokes, began to distance themselves. Nobody wanted to be associated with failure, and her arrogance had left her with few true allies. Every now and then, I would see her on the street. She avoided my eyes, her shoulders slumped, her face marked with exhaustion. Gone was the woman who once strutted through the restaurant barking orders. In her place stood someone broken, someone who had tasted power and lost it all. Then one evening, she came to me. I was standing in the restaurant foyer, greeting customers as they walked in, when she slipped through the door. The chatter died down as eyes turned to her. She looked smaller than I remembered, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Please," she whispered, "I made a mistake. I wasn't myself that night. I didn't mean those words. Can't we find a way for me to come back?" The staff behind me froze, their faces hardening. They remembered every insult, every late paycheck, every cruel command. The silence in the room was thick, but I kept my voice calm. "This place is no longer yours," I said firmly. "You had your chance, and you threw it away when you chose arrogance over respect. This restaurant thrives now, not because of you, but because you're gone." Her eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but no words came. She turned and walked out into the night, her figure shrinking as the door closed behind her. For the first time, I saw her not as my son's wife, not as the woman who had humiliated me, but as a lesson, a living reminder of what happens when pride blinds you to the people who stand by your side. After she left that night, I sat in the quiet of the restaurant long after the last customer had gone. The staff cleaned up around me, their laughter soft, their energy light, but my thoughts wandered to heavier places. Revenge had been sweet, yes. Seeing her stripped of the arrogance that once defined her had satisfied the wound she had carved into my dignity. But as I sat there, I began to realize it wasn't only about revenge anymore. Family is supposed to be sacred. It is supposed to be the one place where we find respect, where love outweighs pride, where kindness replaces cruelty. I had given her that chance. I had welcomed her into my family, given her my support, and even brought my friends to her restaurant in pride. What she had done wasn't just a personal insult, it was a betrayal of that sacred bond. She had chosen humiliation over respect, arrogance over gratitude. And betrayal, I realized, cuts far deeper than insult. But revenge, the way I chose to deliver it, wasn't born from hate. Hate is loud, violent, and blind. What I carried was something different. It was justice. It was balance. She had taken something from me, my dignity in front of others, and I had taken something from her that mattered most. Her pride, her throne, her false sense of power. In doing so, I reminded her, and perhaps everyone else who was watching, that respect is not a favor, it is a requirement. Still, there was a part of me that ached. She was, after all, the woman my son had chosen. I wondered if he saw what I had seen, if he had noticed the cruelty behind her smile long before it erupted in public, or perhaps he had been blinded by love, unwilling to face the truth until it was too late. Whatever the case, I knew I could not carry guilt for what I had done. She had carved her own downfall with her actions. I had simply pulled the final thread. As I looked around the restaurant that night, the same restaurant where I had once burned with shame, I felt something greater than triumph. I felt peace, not because I had destroyed her, but because I had restored myself. Revenge had begun this journey, but dignity had ended it, and that, I realized, was worth more than anything money could ever buy. The months rolled on, and the restaurant became more than just a business. It became a gathering place, a home for laughter, and a symbol of resilience. Every night, the tables filled with families, friends, and neighbors, who came not only for the food, but for the feeling the place carried now. Respect had replaced fear, pride had replaced arrogance, and the same walls that once echoed with humiliation now resonated with joy. The staff grew into something more than employees. They became family. They stood taller, spoke with confidence, and carried a pride in their work that showed in every plate they served. Customers noticed, and word spread beyond the neighborhood. People came from other parts of town, curious to see the restaurant that had risen from the ashes of arrogance and humiliation into a beacon of dignity and success. Every time I stood by the door greeting customers, I remembered the night she had pushed me, the night she had tried to break me. And every time I smiled, not with bitterness, but with peace. She had thought she was powerful that night. She had believed she could humiliate me and walk away unscathed. But arrogance always carries the seeds of its own destruction. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to let those seeds bloom. My revenge was never about money. It was never about control. It was about balance, about reminding her, and perhaps myself, that respect is something you cannot put a price on. In the end, she lost what mattered most to her: power, pride, and reputation. And I regained what mattered most to me: dignity. Now, when I look around the restaurant, I don't see the place where I was once shamed. I see a place where justice was served. I see a legacy, not of anger, but of resilience. I see a reminder that no matter how old you are, no matter how others may try to push you down, you can always rise again, stronger, wiser, and unbroken. And so, I close this chapter of my life with peace in my heart and pride in my soul. My daughter-in-law once pushed me aside like a beggar. Today, I stand as the owner of everything she lost, and that is justice enough. Before you go, please subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Your support means everything.